morning, everybody. Let me welcome you also modestly, because I am not one of the organizers. But it is a great pleasure, really a great pleasure for me to be here. This is my alma mater, and so it is my home in a way. And it is my great pleasure and honor to chair this session. And I thank very much to the organizers to make this happen. So our first speaker is James Underhill from the University of Rouen. He is professor there and a member of the ERIAC research group. He's also coordinator of the Rouen Ethnolinguistic Project, author of 3 books, of which Ethnolinguistics and Cultural Concepts, Truth, Love, Hate and War was published in 2012, and Creating Worldviews was published in 2011. So, as I said, he's professor at the Université de Rouen, Normandy. He lived and taught in Prague at the beginning of the 1990s, and I remember him from this time. And he taught at the University of Economics as well as at the Faculty of Arts here, before becoming a translator. So the title of James's presentation is Individuals or Peoples for Europe. And I was asked to give you each 45 minutes to speak, plus 10 minutes for discussion. Okay, the floor is yours, James.
Thank you very much, Ludmila. It's a great pleasure to be here. So, individuals or people for Europe, if Europe exists after the Brexit, this was going to be a big problem for us to discuss. What does Europe mean for us? We have 45 minutes, so I'll have to go fairly quick because I have to introduce some fairly prestigious people and some fairly varied approaches. So, here we have Normandy. Normandy, you're very welcome to come to the Rouen Ethnolinguistics Project. It's certainly something that's happening. It's continuing over the last 3 or 4 years, and it's something that started, as I mentioned, with Irena Vaňková, who brought us together with Jerzy Balkminski. So, individuals or peoples for Europe, we'll be looking at worldviews today. Communication or culture, that will be my main idea. Are we thinking of language as communication, which it is, but is it more about culture or communication? I'll be asking then if communication or culture should be at the center of language studies. Is this a better? Is this a better? For me. Okay. Is this better for you? Yes. Okay, that's great. Okay then. I'll be asking if communication or culture should be at the center of language studies. This is my plan, very briefly. I'll be introducing various approaches, too quickly I'm afraid, but I have to get through various approaches. The Humboldtian approach, philosophical approaches, semantic approaches, Wierzbicka's natural semantic meta-language, I think you know fairly well here. I'll also be introducing slightly the Lublin School of Ethnolinguistics to show why this works together with Humboldt. And I'll be thinking about translation and translating as what? As a testing ground for cultural specificity, to show what's difficult to translate and what does that show about the nature of languages. I'll consider how various approaches treat words and concepts, how they treat individuals, how they conceive of individuals and their modes of conceiving and perceiving, their worldviews, modes of perceiving and conceiving the world. I'll think about linguistic communities as worldviews, but also in Jerzy Balkminski's field as values, words as entrenched in values. I'll move towards 6 problems of translating individuals in Europe very briefly, to try to get very briefly once more 9 shared principles, or principles we might share if we're ethnolinguists and if we're speaking together about language and culture. I want to conclude though on Humboldt, with Humboldt, because he's not read enough and he's misread often. I want to conclude with a long statement from Humboldt about what is individuation in language. So, It's my job then to open this series of exciting papers and kick off this encounter, which has brought together some very high-profile scholars, with also some very vibrant young scholars, enthusiastic young researchers together here. And we're coming together here to do what? To do what? We're coming here to talk together as Europeans, to think about our Europe. What is our Europe? And to try to understand its evolution and its potential. How is it developing? How is it developing as a shared project? We're coming together as peoples and individuals and languages. Now, we're not sociologists. We're not politicians, historians. We are linguists. But this is a great era of communication. And we're specialists of communication and culture. We know the importance of the new technologies for communication. We also know the importance of a language for communication, and English has become the lingua franca. So we understand this important. We understand the importance of technology. Technology that we have here, the video conferences, the technology of Sistran, Google Translate. These things are daily improved and daily enriched. There's a phenomenal amount of texts being put onto memories of translation which are helping us to translate, helping us to communicate between languages. And we have entered into an era of multilingual resources that improve communication. They offer almost instantaneous solutions to problems that used to take us translators years of long study to master. I believe that business, and this seems to be an evidence, I believe that business, science, education, and politics have been transformed by these innovations. And we have no reason to believe that humanity and we Europeans will not be transformed by the possibilities that those tools, those linguistic tools, are opening up for us, those technological advances. Internet, Skype, video conferences like these, even things like this. The in-ear device that translates foreign languages in real time. A language pilot translator comprises 2 earphones that will allow us to translate from one language to another. These things will transform our ways of living together, our ways of speaking together, from person to person, from culture to culture. But there's a problem. I've gone the wrong way. Okay, there's a problem. Is language about communication or is it about culture? The problem is that the way we define language, culture and communication between cultures, that's the problem of worldviews. What are worldviews and how do they work? The fundamental problem that Humboldt spoke of when he introduced the idea of Weltansichten, worldviews that we learn in language when we learn to formulate ideas, when we learn to conceptualize the world. To conceptualize the world and invent the words we need to share our impressions about what the world is, what it means to us, how we apprehend it, and what we do with it together. As peoples, we need a shared language. English can serve this purpose, perhaps, but as peoples, we need a shared language to speak about our shared destiny as Europeans. But we know that if we forget culture, what do we forget? We forget ourselves, we forget our heritage, we forget our destiny, and to a large extent, we forget our dreams. The past, the present, and the future, but also all those possible worlds that the imagination opens up for us are language-bound, are culture-bound, because we are in language. As Humboldt put it, humans are human through language. Mensch ist Mensch durch Sprache. These three Humboldtian notions here should help us think together as Europeans, to help us think about what language is, what we do with language. Sprachdenken, Denken durch Sprache, thinking in language. Mitdenken, that all thinking will be thinking together with others in dialogue. And Bildung, which can be translated as culture, but it's a difficult question. It can be translated into education also. But what kind of Bildung does Humboldt want? He wants Selbstbildung. He wants the cultivation of the self, the education of others, but the cultivation of the self. This is part of the national community, or the linguistic community. What he's interested in is the destiny of nations, the destiny of cultures. So he'll talk about Nationalbildung, and the Selbstbildung and Nationalbildung works together. That's what I'll try to stress when I'm talking about how we cultivate ourselves in language. Now, we will be discussing these questions and developing these notions in relation to our keynote speakers. Jerzy Bartminski, who we've introduced, and Jürgen Trabant from the Humboldtian, the leading scholar of Humboldtian studies in Berlin, who I've had the pleasure and the honor to work with closely. As you'll know if you follow the REP website, that both of them figure highly on that website, and it's a great pleasure to see them here today. On behalf of us all in Prague today, I'd like to thank them for allowing this encounter between the Berlin School of Humboldtian Studies and the Lublin School of Ethnolinguistics. I'd also, of course, like to thank Irena Vankova for setting this up over the last few years. Her book is the outcome of that work together. I think we should also thank Karol IV, and who has his birthday today, 700 years of Karol IV, because he founded this university. And this noble institution was the second university to be founded in Europe. Founded in 1348. This is an apt and a beautiful rendezvous for us. Is it okay if I sit down because I'm having difficulty changing my pages? Yeah, this is okay? The camera's going to work with this? Okay. I prefer to stand, but in fact it's becoming really quite difficult. Okay, this is an apt and a beautiful rendezvous for us. In the center of Europe, in Mitteleuropa, what the French call the Carrefour des Cultures, the cultural crossroads. And I'd like to warmly welcome all those young researchers here that we've already met in Lublin, in Prague, at other events. They represent, the young researchers, more than anyone else here, the young researchers represent the future of Europe. The future of Europe is a shared academic and social and cultural concern. I'd like to thank the ERIAC Research Group for helping fund the event. This has allowed Rouen and Bratislava and Lublin and Berlin to converge to think about fundamental questions, definitions, methodologies, and above all, about objectives. What do we want to do? What kind of Europe do we want? What kind of Europeans do we want to be? And what are we bringing to Europe, consciously and unconsciously, because culture is part of what we are and what we create, and we will create from our own cultures, from our own encounters with other cultures. So here we have Jürgen Trabant, the great representative of Wilhelm von Humboldt, coming to meet together. This is fundamental for us, that we're going to come together to mitdenken, okay, to think together, to talk together in language, in speech, and consider what Europe is, what individuals, what peoples are. And here we have the encounter in Rep with Adam Guas, who is a great translator and who is unfortunately not with us, but has facilitated, as our colleagues here are facilitating the communication between us all. Now, I believe that this will produce something very interesting. I think this will produce a very creative, imaginative, and exciting event. But it will also consist of failures to understand. Our meeting will be fraught with misunderstandings, because we will fail to understand each other, because we do not necessarily mean the same things when we have the same words. When we speak about Europe, do we talk about the same thing? When we talk about peoples, do we mean the same thing when we talk about people? When we talk about individuals, cultures, Maria Rosaria will be speaking about citizen. Do we mean the same thing when we speak about citizens and the Chinese translate their word? Individual people and individual people in Europe. These are crucial concepts for us, and it's essential. These are concepts that are crucial and essential for European law, for the European Parliament, for the European culture, that we learn to understand each other. We're trying to understand each other. Communication is crucial for this, and we cannot afford to abandon our attempts to communicate our ideas and understand one another. But the problem is translation. To come back to translation, what does translation teach us? If translation teaches us something, it is that we translate from culture to culture, from worldview to worldview. Cultures are complex, and worldviews are always situated. We have no objective neutral ground. There is no middle ground between languages. Our ideas and our identities, our words and our worlds, our worldviews, are shared cultural adventures that grow up out of language. We cultivate ourselves in language, thanks to language, in dialogue and in communication, in conversation. but also in assimilating the history and the culture of our people. And that leads me to the question of untranslatables. What is untranslatable? Well, for this reason, because there are untranslatables, Barbara Cassin's dictionary came out in 2014, but it was a French, originally a French dictionary from 2004. This is an important dictionary because it reminds us of something essential. It reminds us that our concepts are culture bound. The Dictionary of Untranslatables discusses the differences between what does it mean to say culture in English and Kultur en français in high culture, low culture. Bildung in German can be translated into education in English, but in French it's enseignement ou éducation, which is difficult. She discusses these problems and she considers the way different traditions have contributed to our shared traditions. How does cultura in Latin, how does paideia in Greek contribute to the way we understand culture, culture, Bildung in French, English and German? How would we translate these words into Czech? Well, Google translates Bildung into tworzenie, but translates Kultur into Kultura from German. Google Translate does a good job, certainly from English and French. It does a good job, but it has no mind. It does have memory, which is difficult. It has no mind, though. It has no culture. It has no identity, though. So it fails to grasp the problem. And worse, it encourages us to forget the problem. It effaces the problem. And this is what is at stake when we say something is lost in translation. Barbara Cassin's dictionary tells a different story. It focuses on lems. I've moved too quickly, okay. Focuses on lems. It focuses on those units of meaning that are parts of culture. She considers these to be what? To be signposts, navigating mechanisms. They enable us to follow the paths that words travel. The journeys that they invite us to follow when we use words. Now, a vast team of researchers she worked with, and a vast team of researchers and translators that went to producing the English version, what do? They track down the origin of words, and they also show the way different languages open up different horizons, different implications. What are these new horizons? I believe that makes this a Humboldtian project. This study of words and the relationship between words and worldviews seems to me a deeply Humboldtian project, in that it reminds us that words make up our world and that we cannot describe, we cannot interpret the world, we cannot speak about our world together without words. Words define us as much as we define them. They reveal our origins and our desires, our limits and our capacities. Now, how does she begin? Cassin begins with a philosophical dictionary that ends up taking us on a philological adventure. And this is rare in today's day, I believe. She moves from thought to language and tries to come back to thinking in an enlightened, empirical manner. She makes a contribution to what Humboldt would have called Sprachdenken, thinking in language. In a very different way, Anna Wierzbicka focuses on keywords in her natural semantics methods. Both Cassin and Wierzbicka start with words, individual words, but there's a difference. Cassin starts with the concept and seeks the varieties of words and the difficulties they present for translating. Wierzbicka starts with words and tries to generate universals. Rigorously empirical, she tends to conclude, unlike most British and most American scholars, she tends to consider or to conclude that there are relatively few universals. The universals she speaks about are really limited to I, you, it, above, below, before, etc. There's about 70 universals. For her, though, the vast majority of words, of words we'll use today and that our colleagues are translating are culture-specific for Wierzbicka. She focuses on happiness, freedom, Wolność that we had before, homeland. Now, The problem becomes very clear when we start talking about the way we communicate about cultures and cultural differences. Because now we have an awful lot of international studies that will talk about happiness studies. Happiness studies is a universal project, and the music goes with this, and the whole culture, the idea is that we can talk about happiness as a universal concept. And the happiest people in the world, you might have known are the Danes, the happy Danes. The only people that are skeptical about this project, apart from Wierzbicka, are the Danes. They're skeptical because the Danes are not happy with this. They're not happy with this happiness study because nobody asked them if they were happy. They were asked if they were lykkelig. I don't understand what lykkelig means. I start from the point of view that we don't understand what this means. We have lykkelig, glad, tillfreds. Glad is the worst one because it looks like English, and of course it's not English. Does this mean happy, glad, or satisfied? Let's come back to our Carsten Levison is the person who worked on this question here, and Carsten Levison did his PhD with Cliff Goddard, but also Cliff Goddard developed his work with Anna Wierzbicka, and he'll look at all these keywords for Danish culture and show how these are really very, very great problems, okay, to explain what are the keywords and why is happy not a word. To come to the languages that we might be familiar with, to try to understand the problem, let's have a look. To be happy, to be satisfied, to be contented. Is this the same thing as being glücklich sein, zufrieden sein? Is this the same thing as being být šťastný or být spokojený? In French, what would you have? Would you have a binary opposition, or would you have être heureux, être satisfait, être bien? Yeah. Être content aussi. So where would we put these? Are these the same feelings and the same experiences? In Czech, the word that comes to mind for many people, and you're already smiling, of course, but this is a Czech word, pohodě. What does that mean? Alors, see, if we look at when I came to Prague, I didn't have the impression that the Czechs were particularly American, so this feel good, just be happy, don't worry, didn't seem to me a very Czech thing. I learned a very different kind of Czech point of view, but pohodě is a movement, a transformation, a tradition that I have to learn to try to understand what's going on. My question, though, is to move, since Ludmila and me are in France, is that if we contrast who is happy and who's not happy, well, the Czechs may be happy, and if you look on the internet, you'll get sentences like this. Přestaňte se stěžovat a radujte se z života. Stop complaining and get some joy out of life. This doesn't strike me, I don't know, Ludmila, it doesn't strike me as a very French way of thinking. And the French have a very low happiness rate. It's not a very French thing to say. Just stop complaining and get some pleasure out of life. It's not French though, because the French like complaining. They are happy complaining. Complaining makes them happy. Stěžujou se rádi. So naturally, if you ask a French people, êtes-vous heureux? They take it as an invitation to have some fun, and they complain. But if you ask them, sentez-vous bien en France? Êtes-vous bien ici? Many French people will reply, ah oui, on est bien, là, oui, tout à fait. Donc, vite, Géo. Oh, I know. So this whole sort of idea of these concepts that we can translate are very problematic. What are we to conclude? To come back to the question of worldviews, words are formed in worldviews, and they help us to form the worldviews we inherit and that we sustain when we speak. This is something that all cultural linguists teach us. This is something from Jerzy Bartminski's tradition, from Jürgen Trabant's tradition, from Anna Wierzbicka's tradition, but also from Boas Sapir-Whorf to Delheim's. All understand that we're dealing here with Weltansichten, with Sprachsinn, but this is the word that Jürgen Trabant really contributed a great deal to explaining this, the sense of language. But le sens du langage will be the sense and also the sensibility to language, and how we develop and cultivate our sensibility in language. This is one of Jürgen Trabant's French books, but he's written 2 French books and a great many German books. Language offers us then language offers us something very positive. It offers us the free space to create ourselves, to express ourselves, and to define ourselves in terms of others. But freedom itself is a concept that is defined differently from culture to culture, from language to language. And this, of course, Barbara Cassin's dictionary will help us with. Liberté en français is translated into liberty or freedom in English, and it's not quite the same thing. Into Polish, as Maciej Abramowicz explained to us, it's translated into wolność, but into wolność is not quite the same thing as wolnost, and the Czech division into wolnost and swobodny is a difficult one. Misto je wolny, but a person is swobodny. Translation studies and the work of translators, the works that's going on at this moment, is important work because it talks about semantics. The work of translators and translation studies remind us that we are all entangled in language. This is, I'm quoting Jerzy Bartminski here. We're entangled in language, but this doesn't mean that we don't have freedom. We are not slaves to linguistic constraints. We can criticize concepts. We can contest the meaning of words. We can struggle to free ourselves from prejudice and try to see more clearly. But we do this in language. We do this with language. And we do this, cultural linguists remind us, in a specific given language. In Czech, in German, in Polish, in French. In English, we bring our cultural specific worlds and our cultural specific words to the debates in global language. Very specific worldviews are constantly impinging upon the English worldview. They impact upon this global shared worldview that is emerging, that we're creating with English and with Anglo concepts. Now, Jürgen Trabant has greatly criticized this in his in the Globish work. Anna Wierzbicka criticized this in different ways. They've both criticized the global worldview and the emerging Globish, the limits of the Anglo worldview, is the way Wierzbicka will speak about it. How that global community is changing and where that global language is leading us is uncertain. But interaction between languages is part of everyday life for everybody. And what other languages teach us? What do they teach us? They teach us that we open up to their worldviews, or as their worldviews impinge upon our own worldviews through translations, through communication. So there's a culture and a communication aspect to both of those questions. We can reappraise our own shared concepts in one language through translations or through opening to other languages. This happens then in two ways. Through translation that enables us to communicate between languages and between cultures through language learning. We do think in language. But we are free to think freely in language and to move between different worldviews when we learn foreign languages. This is one of the exciting truths that I think the young people are more sensitive to than us, but that all real philologists understand. We cannot step beyond language to enter into some transcendental ideal plane of ideas and abstraction. We can't get out of languages, but we can get out of one language. Jerzy Bartminski puts this in the following way. To liberate oneself from the bondage of words, to overcome illusion and false evaluation imposed by language is perhaps not possible, for it is in the nature of language to simplify, to interpret and evaluate. We are too deeply immersed in language to be able to really go beyond it. However, linguists must not evade the challenge, and they try to evade the challenge, of recognizing this dependence, of determining the nature and depth of linguistic entanglement. We are entangled in language, but the ethnolinguist is not pessimistic about the potential of language. Language educates us, helps us cultivate our senses and our sensibility, and in the same way, learning foreign languages can redouble that learning and open our eyes, but also open our other senses to new facets of reality. Humboldt calls this the Sinn der Nation, okay? He calls about the sense of the nation, the meaning of the nation. The meaning of the nation is broadened by translators who do what? They broaden the scope of language, they broaden the sense of language. Sinn der Sprache, Sprachsinn. This is exactly what excites Jürgen Trabant and Humboldtian scholars. When Humboldt does what? When he celebrates the senses and insists that the way we feel in language is inextricably bound up in the way we think and the way we understand the world. This is why the sense of language, the title of Jürgen's book, is a fundamental notion for us. Individuals experience the world alone and together Together, linguistic communities reinvent their worldviews, modifying worldviews that they inherit. Ethnolinguists can focus on the individual and see how the individual human being develops within the community, or they can focus upon the community and try to understand how individuals contribute to that shared medium, that medium of expression. Now, Jerzy Bartminski is one of the most productive ethnolinguists of his generation, and I believe he has no clear successor in the Lublin School. His sensibility is perhaps too vast, spanning semantics, a variety of Slavic languages, literature, poetry, folk, songs, folklore. The Lublin School continues to attract a great variety of scholars with different sensibilities, and those scholars latch on to one aspect, one facet of the Lublin School's vast project, which has explored meanings and values in language for the past 30 years. In his own words, the ultimate aim of the Lublin School has always been to arrive at the speaking subject, homo loquens, his perception and conceptualization of the world, mentality and value system. Jerzy Bartminski's approach and the one that Stanislava Bartminska has continued, and that has continued with Wojtek Chlebda and with a vast number of Slavic scholars in the Lublin School, are engaged. They focus on words and concepts, the individuals and their modes of conceiving and perceiving, linguistic communities, worldviews and values. Is this a Humboldtian approach? I believe it is. Ethnolinguists, the ethnolinguistics that Lublin embraces investigates linguistic structure in relation to the history and culture of specific communities, especially the mentality of the group, its behaviors and value system. It attempts to discover the traces of culture in the very fabric of language, in word meanings, phraseology, word formations, syntax and text structure. It strives to reconstruct the worldview entrenched in language as it is projected by the speaking subject, as it is experienced by the speaking subject, homo loquens. This is, I believe, a Humboldtian approach, an approach that's proven its worth as a paradigm for studying worldviews at various levels. I myself have been working on the worldviews and having difficulty translating Weltansichten, which is always confused with Weltanschauung in English. I've missed something. Oh yeah, here. I've tend to distinguish Weltansichten into world perceiving and world conceiving in my books, from my Humboldt book in 2009, cultural mindset, which I use to translate Weltanschauung, and then the personal world of the individual, which I divide into something more constant and enduring, the personal world, and the perspective, which is constantly changing as in dialogue. I believe Bartminski's approach is perfectly compatible with this new Humboldtian classification. The Lublin School focuses on what? It focuses on facets of a concept, and determines what is essential to the language and the worldview of the people. The people, the Polish people, or the Czech people, and the Belarusians, and the Ukrainians, and the Serbs, and the Spanish, and all of the people who come to the Lublin School to exchange ideas. Then the Lublin School concentrates on what facets of the concept are highlighted in the various discourses that make use of the shared concept. What does the right wing and what does the left wing press do with the concept of honor, of homeland, of home? Kassan takes us into the logic of the philosophic tradition, the paths of the language. Wierzbicka explores not only words, but cultural traditions, literary texts, and idioms. But as semantics, as a semantics of worldview, I believe the Lublin School takes the Humboldtian approach further by considering synonyms, antonyms, facets, values, literary texts, corpora, and individual worldviews. This enables them to construct a more flexible, a more faithful model of the Polish worldview, not a reductive worldview, although they are trying to get stereotypes, but the relationship with stereotypes is a complex one, a subtle one. This enables them to construct a much more flexible and faithful model of the Polish worldview, and this is what they seek to contrast with the worldviews of other languages. When you strip aside the individual specificities, what is left? What is shared? What do you need to know, to feel, to believe, to take for granted, to be a Pole? And what separates Poles from non-Poles, from foreigners, from outsiders, from those outsiders who might be expatriates, who might live for 20, 30 years but never be quite Polish? What does that mean? What do foreigners have to learn to understand what it means to be Polish? This extends and modifies the Humboldtian project. Humboldt's going to focus on the nation and thinking of one nation, but he'll compare the nations, but this modifies the project. Humboldt focuses on individuals and nations, but he tends to avoid politics. And he tends to avoid politics in his linguistics, and this is paradoxical because Humboldt is one of the few linguist politicians. There are others, as you well know. The great Thomas Masaryk was a great philologist, nation builder, patriot. He was a president that looked on as the Prague School of Linguistics grew strong in the 1920s. Humboldt, what does he do? He defends the German language. As our friend Johnny Joseph reminded us in London in April, at a time when France is closing all of the universities in Europe. Napoleon, his idea is to close universities like this. At this time, Humboldt invents the German university, the Berlin University, and he puts Bildung, culture, at the center, and he puts language at the center. I think I can manage that. Nothing's cool. Okay. As the ambassador of Prussia for London and Rome, among other places, he does work as a politician, but he doesn't consider worldviews as Weltanschauungen. He doesn't consider them as ideological worldviews. Wierzbicka and Bartminski are coming from a very lucid, critical Marxist tradition that understands that no words are innocent. Individual people in Europe are certainly not innocent. They are the concepts and the words that we must use to give our shared destiny a meaning. But in order to carve them into concepts that we can use to help us grow together, we need to understand what these words entail. What do they mean? Where do they come from? And what do they enable us to think together? I'm going to list briefly only 6 examples of questions and problems that ethno-linguistic or cultural linguistics opens up for us. Then I'll go on to propose 9 principles for ethno-linguists that I believe can help us discuss worldviews. These are questions and propositions that I've been developing over the last 10 years, but they've been modified with my work with Maria Rosa Regina Noto in our shared work. So the six questions for ethno-linguistics. Words are, as Jerzy Bartminski knows so well, values, but the value of values fluctuates. Let's go through the 6 ones. Values, words as values, synonyms and antonyms as dynamic oppositions, keywords as conceptual clusters as parts of cultural narratives, keywords and narratives as symbolic and metaphoric constructs, and translating keywords and narratives as a way of searching for counterparts. How does this cause difficulties and allow us to think of these questions? In more detail then. If we think about words as ideals, think of Europe, especially at the present time, when we don't seem to have an ideal for Europe. Well, words are values, sometimes they're an ideal, but if you look in English, where will you find the ideal? In the English book of Oxford Book of Quotations, you'll find French. You'll find that we're quoting De Gaulle when he says, "C'est l'Europe tout entière, l'Europe qui décidera le destin du monde." Europe will decide the destiny of the world. Often, Europe will be an anti-ideal, never neutral, or rarely neutral. Europe is an anti-ideal. Europe's zone is doomed. Often indifference. Business carried on as usual during alterations on the map of Europe. This could be Churchill today. It was the great Churchill of war, but the First World War. As we divided up Europe, the English didn't feel concerned. Often for the English, of course, Europe will simply not exist. It will certainly not exist on the front pages of newspapers. So, neutral or dynamic oppositions. I would suggest that whatever happens, the neutral idea of Europe as the Merriam-Webster's dictionary as Europe is what? Europe is a continent on the eastern hemisphere between Asia and Atlantic area, spanning 3,997,929 square miles, is the definition, but it's one that has very little meaning for us in discussion. It's not one that comes up very often. As far as synonyms and antonyms are used, the dynamic opposition seems to be fundamental for worldviews. If we look at the way individual works with counter, or not oppositions, but it will work with people. And what happens? Individual tends to assert itself in capitalist democracies. We've seen this in Prague over the last 20 years. The people thrives in periods of war, in totalitarian societies, and in periods of national revivals. So you'll find people used in Scottish English, but not so much in English. Folk, which is people in English, is a quaint English term. There's no relationship between folk music and pop music. We've divided up those meanings here. The individual often has negative associations at different times. If we only need to go back to think of Marxist rhetoric to talk about bourgeois individualism, which is associated with selfishness, unpatriotic behavior, and is obviously unpopular. If we look at Paul Dow's dictionary from 1986, his Česko-anglický slovník, we'll find individual translated into individualismus, we'll find individualista, we'll find individualistický, and these are clearly negative. He does have individualita, character, and individualization, but they're secondary. And even individualny is translated as strange or peculiar. Often the Czechs, so clearly at this period in the 1980s, individual is clearly not neutral in the 1980s. Often today, in different periods, the Czechs will prefer to speak about osoba, občan, člověk, or more popular, but clearly Člověcký and Občanský are part of ideological discourse. And this is probably true just as much today as in the post-war communist period. If we look at keywords and conceptual clusters, what interests me is the way that concepts work together and the way that words hang together and are inseparably part of whole meaningful fields of meaning. To look at the Czech example that I used in one of my books was the way that in order to understand the communist worldview, which I think the young people no longer do, you have to understand that stát, historie, lidé are all part of this organized worldview that holds together. This links in what? For the people who are not Czechs or who don't know the Czech tradition, it links into Czech patriotism, the Czech revival of the 19th century, the First Republic rhetoric, and then fuses with layer upon layer of anti-fascist discourse, and then anti-German discourse, and then communist propaganda. And these will hold together in an idea that the people will be forging its destiny as a Czech people in opposition to, and this will hold together the state, the party, the people, and history will all work together. How these concepts are harnessed together in dominant discourses and how they form part of the ideological and cultural mindsets is what interests me, the ideological worldview. How are they adopted? They're part of our shared resources, but how are they adopted and taken over? How are they appropriated? This is the big question for Klemperer, because Klemperer will talk about how does German become transformed by Hitlerdeutsch. If we look then at Volk, Heimat, Fatherland, they all have a vast range of patriotic meanings throughout the German tradition. For Herder and for all the 19th century and 18th century thinkers, a vast range of patriotic meanings. But they're appropriated by Hitlerdeutsch. Heimat survives. Volk and Fatherland, we might consider to be the victims of Hitlerdeutsch. We still have, despite Volkswagen, Volksschule, Volkspark, Volkslied, these all exist, but there's something tragic here. There's a painful hollowness at the heart of the German worldview. All of the extensions exist, but not the center, not the soul, not the people. Kein Volk in Deutschland? This would be my question, my provocation for the Germans to think, how can we think people and extract it, as Klemperer does extract German from the Hitlerdeutsch. These are all part of, these cultural clusters and these conceptual clusters are part of cultural narratives. We don't notice ours. We have to learn them as we learn those other cultural narratives that our grandparents acted out. But the people at certain periods build the road to socialism. There are new narratives, but we don't realize that they're narratives. They seem to us normal, natural. The European Union has its discourses. We speak a lot today about, not about people, but a lot about individuals. We speak a lot about empowering citizens. This is Maria Rosaria's word. We talk about empowering citizens with individual rights. Europe provides them, provides the right, it provides the services, but despite the discourse on empowerment, there's very little power given to the people. And the people, as a term in Europe, is very rarely used. The European Union discourse we speak about, we use populism more. When we speak about the people, it's usually a negative impression of the populism. In European discourse, we speak more about individuals, citizens of member states, but not as actors, but as objects of a top-down democracy. So I'm arguing that these keywords are part of narratives and that these narratives are represented in metaphoric terms. I don't have time to develop this, but Europe will be, in all of the newspapers in Britain for the last 5 years, a ship that's sinking. And if it's not sinking, let's sabotage it. Let's torpedo it. It's a house, but the house is falling apart. The roof is not on. If it's a car, it's stalling. These narratives exist in various languages, and you'll be familiar because English is being translated, but these metaphorical narratives have to be studied, I believe. Translating worldviews, translating keywords and translating these narratives is at the heart of my project for ethnolinguistics. So my 9 I've got about 5 minutes left before my conclusion. No, I have to end. Okay, then I'll go then. Okay, I'll go then on to then the to conclude. Then I will leave on the 9 aspects. Then words as concepts. Ethnolinguists should be thinking about words as concepts, refusing to reduce the word to the sign and to reduce linguistics to communication, the study of signs. Ethnolinguists should remind us of the importance of translating and the difficulties as indications of the differences between languages as worldviews. Looking at metaphoric representations of concepts, thinking in terms of cultural clusters, conceptual clusters, and thinking in terms of these culture-specific narratives, folk tales, symbolic, spatial constructs. Considering diverse and competing ideologies, the way worldviews exist within worldviews, and how do they interact and how do they oppose one another. Thinking of individual perspectives, politics and literature, and fluctuating perspectives when we position ourselves in debate. How do we as individuals adopt the shared language of the people, and how do we adapt it? Okay.